In the mountain village of Greyhollow, Martha and Edmund Blackwood appeared to be blessed, while their neighbors suffered through the harshest winter in living memory. Their children were plump and rosy-cheeked, their pantry never empty, even as families around them watched their own youngsters grow thin and pale. The Blackwoods claimed their fortune came from Edmund's skill as a trapper and Martha's herb garden, but something didn't sit right with the villagers. Travelers would arrive at the Blackwood farmhouse seeking shelter from the bitter cold, drawn by the warm glow of their windows and the promise of a hot meal. They would disappear into that welcoming home, never to be seen again. For years, the village elders dismissed these vanishings as unfortunate accidents. Perhaps the travelers had simply moved on in the night, continuing their journeys elsewhere. But what dark secret kept the Blackwood children so well fed when everyone else was starving? Before we discover the truth buried in their garden, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story grips you, subscribe, because tomorrow brings something even more chilling. The winter of 1847 descended upon Greyhollow like a shroud of ice and desperation. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the village of 43 souls had endured harsh seasons before, but this winter brought a cruelty that seemed to seep into the very bones of the earth. Snow piled against cabin doors in towering drifts, and the wind howled through the valley with a voice that spoke of death and hunger. Martha's recipe book lay open on her kitchen table, its leather binding worn smooth by countless hands. The pages, yellowed with age and splattered with what appeared to be cooking stains, contained recipes that seemed innocent enough at first glance. Beef stew with winter vegetables, roasted fowl with herb stuffing. But in the margins, written in Martha's careful script, were notes that would have chilled any reader who looked closely enough. "Best when the meat is fresh and young," read one notation. "Allowed to age 3 days for tenderness," suggested another. Pastor Cornelius Webb made his rounds through the village. Each morning, his black coat a stark contrast against the pristine white of the snow. At 62, he had shepherded this flock for nearly 3 decades, watching children grow into adults, blessing marriages, and delivering last rites to those who couldn't survive another mountain winter. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen both the beauty and brutality of frontier life, and lately those lines had deepened with worry. The pastor's first stop was always the Hartwell Forge, where Thomas worked despite the bitter cold. The blacksmith's massive frame bent over his anvil, hammering out horseshoes and mending tools that kept the community functioning. Thomas had arrived in Greyhollow 15 years earlier, a man running from memories of war and seeking the peace that only mountain solitude could provide. His arms bore the scars of Confederate artillery, and his eyes held the distant look of someone who had seen too much death. "Morning, Thomas," Pastor Webb called out, stamping his feet to ward off the cold. "How are your supplies hold?" Thomas set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Getting low, Pastor. Same as everyone else. Lost another chicken last night, froze solid in the coop." He gestured toward the Blackwood property visible through the trees. "Though I noticed smoke still rising steady from their chimney. Must be burning something more substantial than the rest of us." The pastor followed his gaze. The Blackwood farmhouse sat on a small rise overlooking the village, its windows glowing warmly in the grey morning light. Even from this distance they could see the family moving about their daily routines, unhurried and well-fed. It was a sight that brought both comfort and unease to the other villagers. Agnes Crow emerged from her cabin, her midwife's bag clutched tight against her chest. At 58, she had delivered nearly every child born in Greyhollow over the past 2 decades, including the 3 Blackwood children. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and lately those eyes had been troubled by things she couldn't quite voice. "Agnes," Pastor Webb called out, "how is the Morrison baby?" The midwife shook her head grimly. "Lost him in the night, Pastor. Just couldn't fight off the cold and hunger any longer. That's the 3rd infant we've buried this winter." She paused, looking up toward the Blackwood house. "Though I noticed little Michael Blackwood playing in the snow yesterday, fat as a summer pig. Strange how some children thrive while others waste away." The village census records, carefully maintained by Pastor Webb, told a story of gradual decline. When he had first arrived in Greyhollow, the population had numbered 67. Deaths from harsh winters, accidents, and the occasional fever had whittled that number down over the years, but this winter seemed different. People weren't just dying, they were disappearing entirely. The Blackwood property sprawled across 12 acres of the most fertile land in the valley. Edmund had claimed it shortly after arriving 5 years ago, explaining that his previous homestead had been destroyed by fire. The house itself was a testament to prosperity. 2 stories of solid timber construction, with a stone chimney that rarely stopped smoking. The barn was well maintained and spacious, and Martha's garden, even buried beneath snow, showed signs of careful cultivation. What unsettled the villagers most was how the Blackwoods seemed immune to the struggles that plagued everyone else. While other families rationed their meager stores of preserved meat and root vegetables, the aroma of cooking food drifted constantly from the Blackwood kitchen. Their children played in the snow with energy that spoke of full bellies, while other youngsters huddled close to dying fires, too weak from hunger to venture outdoors. Edmund Blackwood stood 6 feet tall, with the kind of lean, wiry build that spoke of a lifetime spent working with his hands. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his pale blue eyes held a peculiar intensity that made people uncomfortable during prolonged conversation. When he smiled, which he did often in public, it never quite reached those eyes. His hunting knife, an ornate piece with an elaborately carved bone handle, hung always at his side, a tool he claimed was essential for his trapping expeditions into the surrounding mountains. The blade of that knife bore stains that Edmund insisted came from the blood of deer and rabbits, though Martha scrubbed it daily with lye soap and still couldn't make it gleam clean. The steel had taken on a permanent discoloration, a dark patina that seemed to have seeped into the very metal itself. Edmund would often run his thumb along the flat of the blade while speaking, an unconscious habit that unsettled those who noticed. Martha Blackwood, at 41, possessed a kind of practical beauty that had aged well despite the harsh mountain life. Her auburn hair was always neatly braided and pinned, and her grey dress, while simple, was well maintained and clean, a stark contrast to the patched and worn clothing of her neighbors. Her hands, which should have been cracked and roughened by winter work, remained smooth and soft, as if she spent her days in leisure rather than the constant labor that mountain living demanded. Their eldest child, Benjamin, had just turned 16 and possessed his father's lean build and unsettling intensity. The boy moved with a peculiar awareness, as if constantly alert to things others couldn't perceive. His younger sister Sarah, at 8 years old, had her mother's auburn hair and a cherubic face that concealed an oddly mature understanding of the world. The youngest, Michael, was barely 3, but already showed signs of robust health that seemed miraculous, given the harsh conditions that had claimed so many other children that winter. The Blackwood house itself reflected their mysterious prosperity. While other families had been forced to burn furniture and personal possessions to stay warm, the Blackwood parlor remained fully furnished with carved wooden chairs, a substantial dining table, and even decorative items that spoke of comfort rather than survival. Oil lamps burned regularly in their windows, and the family never seemed to lack for fuel or food. Edmund's story of their arrival in Greyhollow 5 years earlier was simple enough, a family seeking a fresh start after losing their previous homestead to fire. He claimed experience as both a farmer and a trapper, skills that would serve them well in the mountain community. Martha, he explained, had been raised by a woman skilled in herbal remedies and cooking, knowledge that proved valuable in a place where medical care was scarce and food preservation was essential for survival. The family had integrated into village life gradually, but deliberately. Edmund volunteered for community work projects and never refused to lend a hand when neighbors needed assistance. Martha brought preserved foods to families with new babies and shared what she claimed were traditional remedies for common ailments. The children attended the small schoolhouse that Pastor Webb operated in the church basement and participated in community gatherings, yet there were small things that didn't add up for those who paid attention. Edmund's supposed trapping expeditions often lasted several days, but he rarely returned with the quantities of game that would justify such lengthy absences. Martha's herb garden produced vegetables that seemed unusually robust for the soil and climate, as if they were being nourished by something more than compost and mountain water. The children displayed behaviors that struck some villagers as unusual. Benjamin had been caught on multiple occasions examining dead animals with an intensity that seemed unhealthy for a boy his age. Sarah would sometimes make comments during play that demonstrated knowledge no 8-year-old should possess about death and suffering. Even little Michael seemed unusually comfortable around blood and violence, showing no fear when Edmund butchered rabbits in the yard. Their house operated on schedules that didn't match the rhythms of other mountain families. Lights burned late into the night, and smoke rose from their chimney at odd hours. Neighbors sometimes heard sounds of heavy lifting and movement coming from the property well after midnight, though the Blackwoods always had reasonable explanations when asked, preserving meat, rearranging furniture, or dealing with sick animals. The family's generosity, while appreciated by struggling neighbors, also raised questions. They frequently offered to share meals with visitors, insisting that no one should leave their table hungry. This hospitality was legendary in a community where every scrap of food was precious, yet the Blackwoods never seemed to suffer for their charity. The leather satchel had belonged to a traveling merchant named William Henley, a man who dealt in fine fabrics and small luxuries that brought brief moments of joy to isolated mountain community. Inside the abandoned bag, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, were samples of silk ribbons, pearl buttons, and a small mirror with an ornate silver frame. Personal letters from his wife in Charlton spoke of their plans to purchase a larger shop once his mountain circuit proved profitable. The satchel had been found 3 miles from the Blackwood property, partially buried beneath fallen leaves, its contents scattered as if wild animals had investigated it. The pattern had become unmistakable to those willing to acknowledge it. Over the past 3 years, 7 travelers had sought shelter at the Blackwood farmhouse during harsh weather, and not one had been seen leave. Each had been a stranger to Greyhollow. Each had arrived alone, and each had carried possessions that would later turn up in subtle ways throughout the Blackwood household. Pastor Webb had begun keeping his own informal record after the 3rd disappearance. He noted dates, descriptions of the missing persons, and the circumstances of their last known whereabouts. The pattern was too consistent to ignore, yet too circumstantial to present as evidence of wrongdoing. The mountains were dangerous, particularly in winter, and travelers did sometimes lose their way or fall victim to accident. Thomas Hartwell had grown increasingly suspicious after noticing a brass compass among Edmund's tools, a compass he distinctly remembered belonging to a surveyor who had stayed with the Blackwoods the previous autumn. When Thomas mentioned it casually, Edmund claimed to have purchased it from a peddler, but something in his manner suggested otherwise. The surveyor had been a meticulous man who would never have parted with such an essential tool willingly. Agnes Crow's concerns ran deeper than missing possessions. She had delivered all 3 Blackwood children and maintained detailed records of every birth in the village. What troubled her was not just the children's robust health during times of scarcity, but their accelerated development. Benjamin had grown unusually tall for his age. Sarah displayed vocabulary and knowledge beyond her years, and even little Michael showed physical coordination that seemed advanced for a 3-year-old. "It's as if they're being fed better than mother's milk," Agnes confided to Pastor Webb during one of their private conversations. "I've seen families blessed with good fortune before, but this is different. These children are thriving in ways that don't match their circumstances." The villagers had also begun to notice the Blackwoods' selective hospitality. While they claimed to welcome all travelers, certain types of visitors seemed more likely to receive invitations to stay overnight. Single men traveling alone, elderly wanderers with few connections, and anyone carrying valuable possessions found themselves warmly welcomed. Families with children or traveling companions were more likely to be directed to other accommodations in the village. Martha's conversations with other women revealed an unsettling knowledge of anatomy and meat preparation that went beyond typical frontier cooking skills. She could discuss the best methods for preserving different types of flesh, with an expertise that impressed and disturbed her neighbors. Her suggestions for tenderizing tough cuts of meat were remarkably specific, as if she had extensive experience with varieties of protein that other mountain families rarely encountered. The timing of the Blackwoods' apparent prosperity also raised questions. Their best periods of abundance seemed to coincide with the disappearances of travelers. After each vanishing, the family would host generous dinners for neighbors, sharing what Martha claimed were fresh catches from Edmund's hunting expeditions. The meat was always tender and flavorful, prepared with herbs that enhanced rather than disguised the natural taste. Edmund's hunting stories grew more elaborate with each telling, featuring successful expeditions to remote areas of the mountains where game was supposedly more plentiful. He spoke knowledgeably about tracking techniques and animal behavior, yet his descriptions sometimes included details that experienced hunters found questionable. His supposed kills were always processed immediately, he claimed, to prevent spoilage, which explained why neighbors never saw the animals he brought home. The children's behavior during these community meals was particularly noteworthy. While other youngsters would gorge themselves on rare treats, the Blackwood children ate with restraint, as if accustomed to regular abundance. They showed no surprise at the quality of the food, no excitement at the prospect of full bellies, suggesting that such meals were routine rather than exceptional in their household. Young Sarah had once made a comment that chilled Agnes Crow to the bone. While playing with other children, she had casually mentioned that different people tasted different, like how beef was different from pork. When pressed to explain what she meant, the child had looked confused, as if she couldn't understand why her statement was unusual. The silver pocket watch had belonged to James Whitmore, a 23-year-old merchant's son from Richmond, who carried himself with the confidence of youth and prosperity. The timepiece bore an engraved inscription, "To James on his 21st birthday, may time always favor your endeavors. Your loving father, Charles." Now it hung prominently on a chain in the Blackwood parlor, catching the firelight as it swayed gently from its place of honor on the mantelpiece. James had arrived in Greyhollow on a February evening when the wind carried ice crystals that cut like glass, and the temperature had dropped so far that spit froze before hitting the ground. His horse, a fine bay mare with white stockings, had begun showing signs of exhaustion, and James knew better than to push her further in such conditions. The warm glow emanating from the Blackwood farmhouse windows had been a welcome beacon in the gathering darkness. Edmund met him at the door with the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to welcoming strangers. Come in, he insisted, taking the reins of James's horse. "No man should be out in weather like this. Martha's got stew on the stove and plenty of room by the fire." The interior of the Blackwood home impressed James immediately. Unlike the sparse, utilitarian dwellings he'd encountered in other mountain communities, this house spoke of comfort and abundance. Carved wooden furniture gleamed with polish, oil paintings decorated the walls, and the dining table was set with china that would have been appropriate in Richmond's finest homes. Martha Blackwood appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron that bore what looked like fresh bloodstains. "Another traveler caught by winter's teeth," she said with genuine sympathy. "You'll stay the night, of course. No one leaves our table hungry or our hearth cold." The children gathered around James with the curiosity typical of young people in isolated communities. Benjamin, the eldest, asked intelligent questions about life in Richmond and the merchant trade. Sarah hung on every word of James's descriptions of city life, her eyes bright with fascination. Even little Michael seemed drawn to their guest, though his attention focused oddly on James's hands and face rather than his stories. The evening meal exceeded anything James had expected to find in such a remote location. The meat was tender and perfectly seasoned, served with vegetables that must have been preserved with remarkable skill to remain so fresh-tasting in the depths of winter. Martha's cooking displayed a sophistication that surprised him, and Edmund's knowledge of wine. He produced a bottle of claret that would have impressed James's father, suggested education and refinement, beyond what one might expect from a mountain farm. As the evening progressed, James felt increasingly comfortable with his hosts. Edmund regaled him with stories of mountain life, while Martha ensured his glass never emptied and his plate remained full. The children contributed their own observations about the changing seasons and local wildlife, displaying knowledge that spoke well of their upbringing. The conversation eventually turned to James's own circumstances and travel plans. He explained that he was conducting business throughout the mountain communities, carrying samples of fine goods from his father's shop and taking orders for spring delivery. His father, Charles Whitmore, operated one of Richmond's most successful mercantile establishments and had sent James to expand their customer base into previously untapped markets. Edmund showed particular interest in the details of James's route and schedule. Where had he come from? Which communities had he visited? When was he expected to return home? James, warmed by good food and wine, answered these questions freely, never noticing the calculating look that passed between his hosts. As the night deepened, Martha prepared a comfortable bed in the guest room, complete with extra blankets and a warming pan filled with coals. The room was spotlessly clean and furnished with obvious care for visitors' comfort. James retired, feeling grateful for his good fortune in finding such hospitable people in such a harsh landscape. The last entry in James's personal journal, discovered weeks later, described his satisfaction with the warm welcome he'd received and his intention to recommend the Blackwood hospitality to other travelers. He wrote of plans to complete his business in the northern settlements and return to Richmond within the fortnight, bearing orders that would please his father and prove his worth as a businessman. James Whitmore was never seen alive again after that February night. When spring came and his horse was found wandering riderless near the village, Edmund Blackwood claimed the animal had appeared at his barn, obviously abandoned by its owner, who had likely continued his journey on foot. The saddle and bridle, Edmund explained, had been damaged by weather and wild animals, so he had disposed of them. The horse itself became part of the Blackwood livestock, another addition to their mysteriously prosperous holdings. Martha's cooking apron hung on its customary peg beside the kitchen hearth, the heavy canvas fabric bearing stains that resisted even her most vigorous scrubbing efforts. The dark spots and streaks had accumulated over months of use, creating patterns that Martha insisted came from butchering rabbits and preparing wild game. Yet the stains seemed too extensive, too deeply set for the modest amounts of meat that a family of 5 should reasonably consume, even during the harshest winter. Charles Whitmore arrived in Greyhollow on a grey March morning, 6 weeks after his son James had vanished without trace. The elder Whitmore was a man accustomed to getting answers, his success in business built upon persistence and attention to detail. He rode a magnificent black stallion and was accompanied by 2 armed men, not the kind of party that mountain folk typically challenged or dismissed lightly. Pastor Webb met the merchant at the church, recognizing immediately that this man's wealth and connections could bring unwanted scrutiny to their isolated community. Charles Whitmore wasted no time with pleasantries, producing a detailed letter from James that outlined his planned route and schedule. According to the correspondence, James should have completed his mountain circuit weeks ago and returned to Richmond. "My son is methodical in his correspondence," Charles explained, his voice carrying the authority of a man unaccustomed to being denied. "He writes every few days without fail. His last letter mentioned staying with a family named Blackwood, and then nothing. I want to know what happened to him." The search party that formed included Pastor Webb, Thomas Hartwell, and 6 other village men, along with Charles Whitmore and his 2 companions. Edmund Blackwood volunteered to join the search, expressing appropriate concern for the missing young man and offering his knowledge of the local terrain. His willingness to participate seemed to impress Charles, though Pastor Webb noticed something calculating in Edmund's manner. The search began at the Blackwood property, where Edmund provided a detailed account of James's visit. The young merchant had stayed one night, Edmund explained, accepting their hospitality during a particularly brutal storm. In the morning, James had expressed his intention to continue north to the settlements near Copper Ridge, despite warnings about deteriorating weather conditions. Martha corroborated her husband's story, adding details about the breakfast she had prepared for James and her concerns about his traveling alone in such conditions. She had urged him to wait for clearer weather, she claimed, but he had been determined to maintain his schedule. The children, when questioned gently by Pastor Webb, provided consistent accounts of James's visit and departure. The physical search of the surrounding terrain revealed disturbing evidence. James's horse was indeed found wandering in a meadow 3 miles north of the village, but the animal showed signs of having been loose for weeks, rather than days. The saddle and bridle that Edmund claimed to have discarded were nowhere to be found, despite searches of likely disposal sites. More troubling were the personal items discovered scattered throughout the forest. James's leather portfolio, containing business documents and letters of credit, was found wedged beneath a fallen log. His traveling coat was discovered hanging from tree branches nearly a mile away, torn as if by animal claws, but bearing stains that looked suspiciously like blood. Thomas Hartwell's sharp eyes spotted something that made his blood run cold. A piece of fine woolen fabric caught on a thorn bush, fabric that matched the description of James's vest. The location was significant, less than half a mile from the Blackwood property, along a path that led not toward Copper Ridge, as James had supposedly intended, but toward a remote section of Edmund's land, where he claimed to conduct his hunting and trapping. Charles Whitmore's frustration grew as the search progressed. The evidence suggested that his son had met with foul play, yet nothing definitively pointed to any individual as responsible. Edmund's cooperation seemed genuine, and his knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable to the search effort. Martha's obvious distress at the young man's fate appeared sincere, and she repeatedly expressed hope that James would be found safe. The village's response to the search raised additional questions for those paying attention. While most families expressed appropriate concern for the missing traveler, their relief when the search parties moved away from the village was palpable. Agnes Crow noticed that several neighbors seemed unusually nervous when questioned about their own interactions with travelers, as if they feared their own secrets might be discovered. Edmund's behavior during the search struck Thomas as oddly knowledgeable. The man seemed to anticipate where evidence might be found, suggesting search areas with an intuition that went beyond mere familiarity with local terrain. When personal items were discovered, Edmund's reactions seemed measured rather than surprised, as if he had expected such findings. The children's drawings were discovered by Agnes Crow during a visit to the Blackwood home to check on little Michael's persistent cough. Hidden beneath Sarah's bed, the sketches were drawn on scraps of brown paper with charcoal and held with what appeared to be berry juice. The images depicted stick figures gathered around a table, with larger figures serving smaller ones from steaming bowls. What made Agnes's hands tremble as she examined them was the careful detail Sarah had put into drawing what looked suspiciously like human limbs emerging from the serving dishes. After Charles Whitmore's departure, the village settled into an uneasy quiet punctuated by whispered conversations and furtive glances toward the Blackwood property. The merchant had promised to return with territorial authorities if his son wasn't found within a month, a threat that hung over Greyhollow like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Thomas Hartwell found himself studying his neighbors with new eyes, particularly during Sunday services when the entire community gathered in Pastor Webb's small church. The Blackwood family occupied their usual pew near the front, Edmund's deep voice joining the hymns while Martha kept the children properly attentive. Yet Thomas noticed things he had previously overlooked, the way Edmund's gaze seemed to catalogue every person present, the manner in which Martha's attention lingered on the unmarried men and elderly widowers in the congregation. Agnes Crow had begun paying closer attention to the Blackwood children during her rounds through the village. Benjamin's behavior particularly troubled her. The 16-year-old had developed a disturbing fascination with death and decay, often found examining dead animals with an intensity that went beyond normal curiosity. When Agnes encountered him studying the carcass of a frozen bird, his detailed knowledge of anatomy struck her as unnaturally advanced for someone his age. "Look how cleanly the breast meat separates from the bone," Benjamin had explained with enthusiasm that made Agnes's skin crawl. "And see here, where the joints connect. If you know where to cut, the whole thing comes apart easily." His casual expertise in discussing the dismemberment of creatures, combined with his evident pleasure in the process, suggested experience that no farm boy should possess. Young Sarah's behavior proved equally unsettling in different ways. The 8-year-old had begun making comments during play that revealed knowledge no child should have about human suffering and death. When asked about her drawings, she described them as pictures of feeding time, explaining matter-of-factly that everyone needed to eat and that her family was very good at making sure nobody went hungry. The village folklore that Agnes's grandmother had shared began to take on new significance in light of recent events. Stories of wendigos, cannibalistic creatures born from desperate hunger, had been part of mountain tradition for generations. According to legend, people who resorted to eating human flesh to survive could transform into monsters driven by insatiable appetites. While Agnes had always dismissed such tales as superstition, the parallels to the Blackwood situation were becoming difficult to ignore. Pastor Webb noticed changes in the family's church attendance patterns. While they continued to occupy their regular pew, their participation in communion had become inconsistent. Edmund would sometimes decline the sacramental wine, claiming stomach troubles, while Martha seemed uncomfortable during scripture readings that dealt with sacrifice and consumption of flesh. The children, particularly Sarah, would fidget restlessly during sermons about Christian charity and caring for strangers. The physical evidence of the family's prosperity continued to accumulate in ways that defied rational explanation. Despite the harsh winter that had depleted everyone else's resources, the Blackwoods seemed to have access to fresh meat regularly. The smoke that rose constantly from their chimneys suggested cooking fires that required substantial fuel, yet their woodpile never seemed to diminish appreciably. Thomas began keeping his own informal watch on the Blackwood property from his forge, which provided a clear view of their daily activities. He noted the family's unusual schedule, heavy activity in the cellar during late evening hours, the transportation of large bundles from the house to an area behind the barn, where Edmund claimed to dispose of hunting waste, and the regular washing of what appeared to be an excessive amount of bloody clothing and linens. The isolation that had once protected Greyhollow from outside scrutiny now began to feel oppressive to some residents. The village's remoteness, which had allowed them to govern themselves according to frontier justice and practical necessity, also meant that disturbing developments could continue unchecked by external authority. The nearest territorial officials were more than a week's travel away, and communication with the outside world depended entirely on the irregular visits of traders and travelers, many of whom had recently begun avoiding Greyhollow altogether. Samuel Harrison's medical bag contained the instruments of a man dedicated to healing: bone saws for surgical procedures, glass vials of laudanum and mercury compounds, lancets for bloodletting, and forceps for difficult birth. The leather satchel had traveled with him through 3 states as he provided medical care to isolated communities that rarely saw trained physicians. Now the bag rested in a shallow grave behind the Blackwood barn, its contents scattered among human remains that told a story far different from the one Edmund would later tell about the doctor's departure. Harrison had arrived in Greyhollow during the 3rd week of March, summoned by a letter from Pastor Webb describing an outbreak of fever that had claimed 2 elderly residents and left several others bedridden. The 54-year-old physician had spent his career serving frontier communities, understanding that his services could mean the difference between a settlement's survival and abandonment. His first observations upon examining the sick villagers troubled him professionally. The symptoms, weakness, wasting, and a peculiar pallor, resembled malnutrition more than infectious disease. Yet when he suggested that improved nutrition might be more beneficial than bloodletting, several patients looked at him with expressions that bordered on despair. "Doctor," Agnes Crow had whispered during a private moment, "we're all eating the same poor fare. Roots, preserved vegetables from last summer, and what little game the men can catch. All except one family." Her meaningful glance toward the Blackwood property conveyed more than her words. Dr. Harrison's medical training had taught him to observe details that others might miss. During his rounds through the village, he noted the stark contrast between the Blackwood children's robust health and the weakened condition of their peers. While other youngsters showed signs of winter's hardships, sunken cheeks, listless behavior, and the telltale symptoms of inadequate nutrition, the Blackwood children displayed energy and physical development that suggested abundant, high-quality food. The invitation to stay with the Blackwood family came after Dr. Harrison had spent 3 days treating patients in the village. A sudden storm had blown in from the north, bringing with it winds that howled through the valley and snow that fell so heavily it obscured visibility beyond a few yards. Edmund appeared at the church, where Dr. Harrison was tending to old Mrs. Kelman, offering shelter until the weather cleared. "No sense risking the storm, Doctor," Edmund had said with his characteristic smile. "Martha's got hot soup on the stove and a warm bed ready. We'd be honored to host a man of your education and dedication." The Blackwood home impressed Dr. Harrison immediately, not just with its comfort, but with subtle details that suggested medical knowledge. Martha's questions about his treatments were surprisingly sophisticated, demonstrating familiarity with anatomical terms and medical procedures that went beyond typical frontier first aid. Her herb garden, she explained, included plants specifically cultivated for their medicinal properties. The evening meal exceeded Dr. Harrison's expectations significantly. The meat was tender and flavorful, prepared with herbs that enhanced its natural taste. When he complimented Martha on the quality of the venison, smiled, and explained that Edmund's hunting skills provided them with the finest cuts. The portion sizes were generous to a fault, and Martha insisted on refilling his plate multiple times, despite his protestations. During dinner conversation, Dr. Harrison shared his concerns about the village's apparent malnutrition problem. The Blackwoods listened with appropriate sympathy, though he noticed glances between Martha and Edmund that seemed to carry private meaning. Their children contributed to the discussion with observations that struck him as unusually mature for their ages. Benjamin asked detailed questions about human anatomy that impressed Dr. Harrison with their sophistication. The boy's knowledge of skeletal structure and organ placement was remarkably advanced, suggesting either exceptional education or unusual practical experience. When Dr. Harrison complimented the family on Benjamin's learning, Edmund proudly explained that they encouraged their children's curiosity about all aspects of life and death. The guest room where Dr. Harrison retired was comfortable and well appointed, with fresh linens and adequate warmth. His last diary entry, written by lamplight before sleep, expressed gratitude for the Blackwood hospitality and noted his intention to recommend their home to other traveling professionals who might need accommodation in the area. Harrison never completed his planned departure the following morning. According to Edmund's later account, the physician had received word of a medical emergency in a settlement to the north and had left before dawn, taking only his essential supplies and leaving his heavier equipment behind for retrieval on a future visit. The storm, Edmund explained, had cleared during the night, providing a window of opportunity that the dedicated doctor couldn't ignore. The brass dinner bell that summoned the Blackwood family to meals bore peculiar indentations along its rim, marks that looked suspiciously like human teeth had gnawed at the metal. Martha claimed the damage came from their old dog, long since deceased, but the pattern of the marks suggested something with human dental structure had worried at the bell's surface during moments of extreme hunger or agitation. By April, the village of Greyhollow had reached a breaking point that went beyond mere winter hardship. The failed harvest from the previous autumn, combined with livestock losses and the unusually harsh weather, had created conditions of genuine starvation. Families had consumed their seed grain, slaughtered their breeding animals, and stripped bark from trees to make a bitter flour that provided minimal nutrition. Yet through all of this suffering, the Blackwood family continued to thrive with an abundance that had become impossible to ignore or explain away. Their children played energetically in the spring sunshine, while other youngsters lay listless from hunger. Martha's weekly contributions to church dinners included fresh meat and vegetables that should have been impossible to obtain, and Edmund's hunting expeditions continued to yield results that defied the experiences of other village hunters. The situation reached a crisis when young Sarah Blackwood made a comment that chilled every adult within hearing. While playing with other children near the church, she had casually mentioned that her family never went hungry because they knew where to find the sweetest meat when the animals run away. When pressed to explain what she meant, the 8-year-old had described how people who visited their house sometimes stayed for dinner in a special way. Agnes Crow, who overheard this conversation, immediately sought out Pastor Webb and Thomas Hartwell. The three adults questioned Sarah gently but persistently, trying to understand what the child meant by her cryptic comments. Sarah seemed genuinely confused by their concern, explaining matter-of-factly that some visitors became part of the family meals, which was why she and her brothers were never hungry like the other children. The confrontation came on a grey April morning when Thomas Hartwell approached Edmund, directly about the family's mysterious prosperity. Thomas had spent sleepless nights wrestling with his suspicions, and his military experience had taught him to face difficult truths rather than avoid them. He found Edmund behind the barn, engaged in what appeared to be the disposal of animal remains. "Edmund," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil, "people are asking questions about your good fortune, about the travelers who stay with your family and are never seen leaving." Edmund's response was immediate and violent. The friendly mask that he had worn for 5 years dropped away, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. His hand moved instinctively to the hunting knife at his side, and his pale blue eyes took on the flat, predatory look of a man prepared to kill. "Are you accusing me of something, Thomas?" Edmund's voice carried a threat that made the blacksmith's combat instincts flare to life. "Because accusations are dangerous things in a place like this. People who make false accusations sometimes find themselves in unfortunate circumstances." The two men faced each other across the blood-stained ground behind the barn, both understanding that a line had been crossed from which there could be no retreat. Thomas noted the scattered bones among the refuse, bones that looked suspiciously human in their proportions and structure. Edmund saw the recognition in Thomas's eyes and knew that his family's secret had finally been discovered. "You can't prove anything," Edmund said, his hand tightening on his knife handle. "And even if you could, who would believe such a story? We're respected members of this community. We've helped our neighbors, shared our good fortune, welcomed travelers with Christian hospitality." Thomas backed away slowly, his own hand moving to the hammer tucked in his belt, a tool that could serve as a weapon if necessary. "The bones, Edmund. Those aren't from deer or rabbits. And that knife of yours, I've seen enough battlefield wounds to recognize blood that won't wash clean." The standoff ended when Martha appeared from the house, calling Edmund in for the midday meal. The domestic interruption broke the tension temporarily, but both men understood that the confrontation was far from over. Edmund's threatening smile as he turned toward the house promised that Thomas's suspicions would not be allowed to spread unchallenged. That evening, Thomas found his forge door barred from the outside and smelled smoke that suggested someone had been burning evidence nearby. The message was clear: the Blackwood family would protect their secret through violence if necessary, and anyone who threatened their way of life would face the same fate as the missing travelers. The hidden cellar key was forged from iron in an ornate pattern that suggested old-world craftsmanship, its head shaped like a twisted vine with thorns. Edmund kept it on a leather cord around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, and only removed it during the family's most secretive activity. The key unlocked a root cellar that served a far more sinister purpose than food storage. Within its stone walls, the Blackwood family prepared and preserved their ghastly harvests. Pastor Webb's decision to organize covert surveillance of the Blackwood property came after 3 sleepless nights of prayer and soul-searching. The man of God found himself confronting questions that challenged everything he believed about Christian charity and the fundamental nature of evil. Could a family that had sat in his church pews for 5 years, that had sung hymns and recited prayers, truly be capable of the monstrous acts that evidence suggested? The surveillance team consisted of Pastor Webb, Thomas Hartwell, and 2 other village men, Henry Morrison, whose infant son had died during the harsh winter, and David Kelman, a widower whose wife had passed the previous autumn. These men had volunteered not from curiosity, but from a desperate need to understand why their families suffered while the Blackwoods prospered. They positioned themselves in the tree line, overlooking the Blackwood property on a moonless night in late April, when spring's arrival had softened the ground enough to muffle their movements. What they witnessed over the course of 6 hours challenged their understanding of human nature and confirmed their darkest suspicions. The family's nighttime activities began around 11 o'clock, when normal families would have been asleep for hours. Edmund emerged from the house carrying what appeared to be wrapped bundles, making multiple trips to a shed behind the barn that the watchers had assumed was used for storage. Martha and Benjamin joined him, all three working with the efficiency of people following a well-established routine. The shed, they realized, housed equipment that had nothing to do with farming or hunting. Through gaps in the wooden walls, the watchers glimpsed hooks suspended from the ceiling, wooden tables stained dark with use, and tools that belonged in a butcher shop rather than a mountain homestead. The family worked in near silence, their movements coordinated as if they had performed these tasks countless times before. Most disturbing was the casual nature of their work. This wasn't the desperate act of people driven to extremes by hunger, but the methodical routine of individuals who had long ago crossed moral boundaries and established a new normal. Martha directed the process with the authority of someone skilled in food preservation, while Benjamin assisted with the casual competence of a young man raised in the trade. Thomas Hartwell, whose military experience had exposed him to battlefield carnage, found his hands trembling as he watched the family's activities. The systematic nature of their work, the specialized equipment, and the obvious familiarity with human anatomy suggested that the Blackwoods had been practicing cannibalism not as a survival measure, but as a preferred method of acquiring food. The surveillance also revealed the location and extent of the family's disposal methods. Behind the barn, in an area that Edmund had claimed was a compost pile for garden waste, the watchers discovered evidence of a boneyard where human remains had been systematically broken down and scattered. The rich, dark soil that Martha praised for its fertility was fertilized with the ground remains of murder victims. Pastor Webb found his faith shaken to its core by what he witnessed. The family that had appeared to embody Christian virtues, hospitality, charity, care for their children, was revealed as practitioners of the most fundamental taboo known to civilization. Yet even as he struggled with horror and revulsion, he couldn't escape the realization that the Blackwoods had survived and thrived, while his own flock suffered and died. The watchers documented the family's use of what appeared to be a sophisticated preservation system in their cellar. The iron key that Edmund wore unlocked a stone-lined chamber where meat was salted, smoked, and stored in conditions that would prevent spoilage. The quantity of preserved flesh visible in the brief moments when the cellar door stood open suggested that the Blackwood family had been accumulating their harvest for months or even years. David Kelman, whose grief over his wife's death had left him emotionally fragile, nearly revealed their position when he recognized personal effects belonging to his deceased spouse among items being processed by the family. The sight of Martha handling his wife's wedding ring while sorting through a traveler's possessions required physical restraint from Thomas to prevent him from charging toward the house in rage. By dawn, the four watchers had accumulated enough evidence to confirm their worst fears about the Blackwood family, but they also understood that they faced an enemy far more dangerous and organized than they had imagined. Martha's correspondence lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom she shared with Edmund, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect the pages from moisture. The letters to her sister Elizabeth in Tennessee revealed the horrifying evolution of the Blackwood family's practices, written in Martha's neat script with the casual tone of someone discussing routine household matters. "The children have adapted well to our new diet," read one passage. "Benjamin shows particular aptitude for the preparation work, and even little Sarah understands that our special meals must remain our family secret." The investigation into the Blackwood family's past required careful discretion, as direct inquiries might alert them to the growing suspicions. Pastor Webb used his connections with other clergy throughout the mountain regions to gather information about the family's history before their arrival in Greyhollow. The picture that emerged was one of a nomadic existence marked by mysterious disappearances and unexplained prosperity. The Blackwoods had lived in at least 3 different communities over the previous decade, never staying in one place for more than a few years. Each departure had been prompted by circumstances that followed a similar pattern: accusations of impropriety, investigations by local authorities, and the family's sudden relocation under cover of darkness. They had used different surnames in each location, making their trail difficult to follow, but certain details remained consistent across all accounts. In Millerville, Kentucky, they had been known as the Ashworth family. Edmund had claimed to be a traveling preacher, while Martha had established herself as a midwife and herbalist. 3 traveling merchants had disappeared during the family's 18-month residence, along with an elderly widow who had been found of the children. The family had vanished the night before a planned search of their property, leaving behind a house that neighbors described as containing disturbing evidence that was never fully explained in official reports. Their time in Copper Falls, Tennessee had lasted nearly 3 years under the name Whitfield. Edmund's role as a cattle buyer had provided perfect cover for his activities, as it explained both his frequent absences and his access to butchering equipment. During this period, 7 people had disappeared, including 2 children whose parents had died in an epidemic. The family's departure had coincided with the arrival of territorial marshals investigating reports of cannibalistic activity in the region. Agnes Crow's investigation focused on the Blackwood children and revealed disturbing evidence of their conditioning from an early age. Through careful questioning of Sarah during a routine health visit, Agnes learned that the child had been taught to view their family's practices as normal and necessary. Sarah spoke matter-of-factly about harvest time, when special visitors would provide food for the winter, and she demonstrated knowledge of human anatomy that no 8-year-old should possess. Benjamin's journal, discovered when Agnes offered to help Martha with spring cleaning, provided the most damning evidence of the family's systematic approach to murder and cannibalism. The 16-year-old had been keeping detailed records of their activities, including dates, victim descriptions, and notes on preparation techniques. His writing revealed not horror or reluctance, but scientific curiosity about the most efficient methods of processing human remains. "Father says it's important to understand every aspect of our food preparation," Benjamin had written. "Different ages require different cooking methods. The elderly can be tough and benefit from long, slow cooking, while younger subjects are naturally more tender. Mother's herb combinations help mask any unusual flavors that might concern guests who join us for dinner." The most chilling revelation came from Martha's letters describing the family's initiation rituals for their children. Young Michael, despite being only 3 years old, had already participated in what Martha called preparation ceremonies, where he was taught to view human flesh as a normal food source. The family had developed elaborate justifications for their activities, portraying themselves as survivors who had simply adapted to harsh realities that weaker people couldn't face. Martha's correspondence also revealed the family's selection criteria for victims. They preferred solitary travelers with minimal connections to their home communities, people whose disappearances would generate limited investigation. The family had developed sophisticated methods for identifying suitable targets, using Edmund's apparent helpfulness and Martha's maternal warmth to gather information about potential victims' backgrounds and travel plans. The letters described a twisted family structure where cannibalistic practices had become a source of pride and bonding. The children competed to please their parents through their participation in murders and food preparation, viewing their special knowledge as evidence of their superiority over other families. Martha wrote fondly of Benjamin's eagerness to learn new techniques and Sarah's innocent acceptance of activities that would horrify normal children. Most disturbing was the family's long-term planning. Martha's letters discussed their intention to establish a permanent base of operations in Greyhollow, using their reputation as model citizens to deflect suspicion while continuing their predatory activities indefinitely. They viewed the isolated mountain community as perfect hunting grounds where their crimes could continue undetected for years. Benjamin's journal was bound in dark leather and filled with entries written in a careful, educated hand that revealed the mind of a young man torn between inherited evil and emerging conscience. Hidden beneath his mattress, the diary contained detailed confessions of the family's murderous activities, written with the clinical detachment of someone documenting scientific observations rather than moral atrocities. The final entries showed signs of internal struggle as Benjamin began to question the rightness of their way of life. The psychological conditioning of the Blackwood children represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the family's crime. Benjamin at 16 possessed memories stretching back to early childhood, when participation in murder and cannibalism had been presented as normal family activities. His journal entries revealed the systematic process by which Martha and Edmund had shaped their children's understanding of morality and survival. I remember being 5 years old when Father first showed me how to use the special knives, Benjamin wrote in one entry. Mother explained that our family was different from others because we understood truth that weaker people couldn't accept. She said that some visitors came to our house not just for shelter, but to become part of our family in the most important way possible, by nourishing us through the winter months. The journal documented the family's elaborate rituals surrounding their cannibalistic practices. Victims were selected through careful observation and planning, with family discussions about each potential target's suitability. Benjamin described these conversations with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recalling ordinary household decisions, yet his later entries showed growing awareness that other families didn't engage in similar planning. Martha's role as the family's spiritual guide emerged clearly from Benjamin's descriptions. She had created a twisted theology that justified their actions through selective interpretation of biblical passages about sacrifice and communion. The children were taught that consuming human flesh created a sacred bond between their family and their victims, transforming murder into a form of twisted sacrament. Mother says that when we share a meal prepared from those who sought our shelter, we honor them by making them part of us forever, Benjamin recorded. She reads from scripture about the body and blood, explaining how our family practices the truest form of communion. The visitors don't really die, they become part of something greater than themselves. The conditioning process had been so thorough that Benjamin struggled to articulate his growing doubts about their activities. His journal entries from recent months showed increasing confusion as he observed other families and began to recognize that normal people viewed death and consumption of human flesh with horror rather than reverence. Sarah's innocent participation in the family's crimes provided another layer of horror to Benjamin's accounts. The 8-year-old had been raised from birth to view cannibalism as natural, and her casual comments about their activities reflected complete normalization of behaviors that would traumatize ordinary children. Benjamin wrote with growing concern about his sister's complete lack of understanding regarding the wrongness of their actions. Sarah asked me yesterday why the children in the village look so sad and hungry when we have plenty of good food, Benjamin recorded. When I tried to explain that other families don't eat the same things we do, she seemed genuinely confused. She suggested that Father should teach the other men how to hunt the way our family hunts, not understanding that what we hunt walks on 2 legs instead of 4. The journal revealed the family's sophisticated methods for disposing of evidence and maintaining their facade of respectability. Benjamin described helping to scatter bone fragments throughout Martha's garden, grinding larger pieces into fertilizer, and burning clothing and personal effects that might identify victims. The family had developed efficient systems for processing human remains that left minimal evidence of their crimes. Most disturbing were Benjamin's descriptions of his own participation in murders. The journal contained matter-of-fact accounts of helping to overpower victims, assisting with butchering activities, and participating in the family's cannibalistic meals. Yet his recent entries showed signs of emotional distress as he began to understand the magnitude of their crimes. I dreamed last night about the merchant's son who stayed with us in February, Benjamin wrote in one of his final entries. In the dream, he was still alive, asking me why we had killed him when he had shown us nothing but gratitude and friendship. When I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that what we did to him was wrong. though I don't understand why I feel this way now when I didn't feel it then. The journal's most recent entries revealed Benjamin's growing isolation within his own family as his conscience began to develop. He wrote about feeling unable to discuss his doubts with his parents, knowing that they would view his questions as weakness or betrayal. The 16-year-old was trapped between the only reality he had ever known and a growing awareness that his family's way of life was fundamentally evil. The bone fragments embedded in the soil of Martha's herb garden told a story of systematic murder that spanned years. Agnes Crow had come to gather wild mint for treating stomach ailments when her practiced eye noticed what others had missed: pieces of human skull mixed with the dark earth, finger bones scattered among the roots of medicinal plants, and teeth that gleamed white against the black soil. The garden that had produced such abundant herbs and vegetables was fertilized with the ground remains of the Blackwood family's victims. Agnes knelt among the herb beds with growing horror, her trained fingers recognizing the unmistakable texture and shape of human bones. As a midwife who had handled countless infants and prepared many bodies for burial, she possessed intimate knowledge of human anatomy that left no room for doubt about what she was discovering. The fragments were numerous and widespread, suggesting not one or two victims, but dozens of people reduced to fertilizer for Martha's plants. The discovery came during a routine visit to check on little Michael's persistent cough. Martha had invited Agnes to gather herbs from the garden while she prepared a tea remedy, praising the exceptional quality of soil that produced such robust plants. The irony was not lost on Agnes, as she realized that Martha's pride in her garden's fertility stemmed from the most horrific source imaginable. Each handful of soil revealed new evidence of the Blackwood family's crimes. Agnes found pieces of jewelry embedded in the earth, a wedding ring that she recognized as belonging to a traveling seamstress who had disappeared the previous autumn, a brass button from a military uniform that matched one worn by a veteran who had sought shelter during a blizzard. These personal items had become part of the garden's foundation, mixed with human remains and composted into the rich black earth that Martha claimed was enhanced by her special methods. The systematic nature of the disposal became clear as Agnes examined different areas of the garden. The bones had been deliberately broken into small pieces before being distributed throughout the soil, ensuring that they would decompose quickly while providing nutrients for plant growth. The Blackwood family had turned murder into an agricultural system, using their victims to ensure the abundance that marked them as different from their struggling neighbors. Martha's voice calling from the house interrupted Agnes's horrific discoveries, forcing her to compose herself while carrying the terrible knowledge of what lay beneath the plants she had admired for years. The mint tea that Martha served took on a nauseating significance when Agnes realized that the herbs had been nourished by human remains, their robust flavor derived from the most unholy source. The scope of the Blackwood crimes became apparent as Agnes conducted a mental inventory of missing persons from the past 5 years. The number of bone fragments suggested that the family had killed far more people than the village had realized, including victims whose disappearances had never been connected to the Blackwood household. The garden represented a mass grave, disguised as agricultural success. Agnes's medical knowledge allowed her to identify evidence that others might have missed. Among the bone fragments, she recognized pieces from different age groups. The delicate bones of children mixed with the robust remains of adults, the curved ribs of elderly victims alongside the straight bones of younger people. The Blackwood family had been indiscriminate in their selection of victims, viewing all travelers as potential sources of nourishment. The realization that she had unknowingly assisted in covering up these crimes by using herbs grown in this unholy soil filled Agnes with revulsion and guilt. How many times had she prepared remedies using plants nourished by murder victims? How many patients had she treated with herbs that drew their potency from human remains? The knowledge transformed every medical treatment she had provided, using Martha's herbs, into an unwitting participation in cannibalism. The methodical approach to body disposal, revealed the family's long-term planning and experience. The bones showed signs of having been deliberately processed, cut marks that indicated systematic dismemberment, grinding marks that suggested the use of tools to reduce larger pieces to fragments, and burn marks on some pieces that indicated partial cremation to accelerate decomposition. This wasn't the desperate improvisation of people driven to extremes, but the refined technique of experienced killers. Agnes found herself trapped between her duty to expose these crimes and her fear of what the Blackwood family might do if they discovered her knowledge. Martha's innocent questions about which herbs Agnes found most useful took on sinister meaning when viewed in the context of what fertilized their growth. The friendly conversation about gardening techniques became a horrific discussion of agricultural methods that depended on human sacrifice. The discovery in the herb garden represented the final piece of evidence needed to confirm the villagers' worst suspicions about the Blackwood family, but it also revealed the true magnitude of their crimes and the sophisticated methods they used to conceal them. The meat smoker stood behind the Blackwood barn like a monument to systematic horror, its wooden frame blackened by years of use and stained with substances that told the story of the family's true activities. Built from oak planks and fitted with iron hooks suspended from crossbeams, the structure had been designed specifically for preserving human flesh through smoking and curing. The hooks bore the marks of heavy use, their metal surfaces worn smooth by countless bodies that had hung there during the family's ghastly food preparation rituals. Pastor Webb led the systematic excavation of the Blackwood property on a grey morning in early May, when the spring thaw had softened the ground enough to reveal what winter's frozen earth had concealed. The village men worked with grim determination, their shovels uncovering evidence that confirmed their worst fears about their neighbors. Each scoop of soil brought new horrors to light, fragments of clothing, personal belongings, and human remains that painted a picture of systematic murder spanning years. The excavation revealed the true extent of the Blackwood family's operation. Behind the barn, what Edmund had claimed was a compost pile for agricultural waste proved to be a carefully organized disposal site where human remains had been processed and distributed. The soil contained layers of evidence that told the story of dozens of victims, their bones broken down and scattered in a pattern that showed methodical planning rather than desperate improvisation. Thomas Hartwell's discovery of the smokehouse revealed the family's sophisticated approach to food preservation. Inside the wooden structure, iron hooks hung from sturdy beams, their surfaces polished smooth by constant use. The walls were blackened, not just by smoke from cooking fires, but by substances that spoke of the building's true purpose. Stains that could never be washed clean marked the wooden planks, and the smell that permeated the structure was unlike anything produced by smoking venison or pork. The smokehouse contained equipment that belonged in no ordinary homestead. Sharp knives designed for butchering, bone saws for dismemberment, and grinding stones for reducing remains to fragments revealed the family's systematic approach to processing human bodies. These tools showed signs of regular maintenance and frequent use, suggesting that the Blackwood family had refined their techniques over years of practice. Agnes Crow's examination of the remains revealed victims from throughout the region and beyond. She identified jewelry and clothing fragments belonging to people who had disappeared, not just from Greyhollow, but from settlements throughout the mountain territory. The scope of the Blackwood crimes extended far beyond what the village had imagined, encompassing a network of murder that had claimed lives across multiple communities. The identification of specific victims brought personal anguish to several village families. David Kelman found confirmation that his wife, who had supposedly died of fever during the previous winter, had actually been murdered by the Blackwoods when she had gone to their house seeking herbs for her illness. Her wedding ring, discovered among the bone fragments, provided undeniable proof that the family Agnes had mourned had actually been killed and consumed. Henry Morrison's grief turned to rage when he realized that his infant son, who had supposedly died of cold and hunger, had likely been murdered during a visit to the Blackwood house, where Martha had claimed to be treating the child's illness. The discovery of tiny bones among the remains in the smokehouse suggested that the family's cannibalism extended even to the youngest and most vulnerable members of the community. The excavation revealed evidence of the family's long-term planning and organization. The disposal sites were arranged in a pattern that showed systematic rotation, ensuring that remains would decompose efficiently while providing fertilizer for different areas of the property. The family had created an agricultural system based on murder, using their victims to ensure the abundance that had marked them as uniquely prosperous. Pastor Webb struggled with the theological implications of what they had discovered. The Blackwood family had attended his church services, participated in communion, and presented themselves as devout Christians while practicing the most fundamental violation of God's commandments. Their ability to maintain this facade while systematically murdering and consuming their neighbors challenged his understanding of evil and redemption. The physical evidence painted a picture of crimes that went beyond simple cannibalism driven by hunger. The sophisticated equipment, the methodical disposal methods, and the systematic selection of victims revealed a family that had chosen murder and cannibalism as a way of life, rather than a desperate response to hardship. The Blackwoods had created a sustainable system of predation that could have continued indefinitely if not for the village's growing suspicions. The discovery of the smokehouse and its contents marked the point of no return in the village's relationship with the Blackwood family. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore or explain away, and the personal connections to specific victims made denial impossible. The community faced the horrible realization that they had harbored monsters among them for 5 years, unknowingly enabling crimes that violated every principle of civilized society. The constable's badge bore the territorial seal of Virginia, its brass surface tarnished from years of frontier service, but still carrying the weight of legal authority that Greyhollow had never before required. Constable William Morrison had ridden hard from the county seat after receiving word of the discoveries at the Blackwood property, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that he was about to confront crimes that defied civilized understanding. The badge represented the arrival of outside law in a community that had governed itself through necessity and mutual agreement for decades. Constable Morrison's arrival coincided with Charles Whitmore's return to Greyhollow, the merchant having made good on his promise to involve territorial authorities in the search for his missing son. The two men represented different aspects of justice. Morrison carried the legal authority to make arrests and conduct official investigations, while Whitmore brought the resources and connections to ensure that crimes would not be swept aside by frontier isolation. The evidence that Pastor Webb and the village men presented to Constable Morrison exceeded anything the lawman had encountered in 20 years of frontier service. The systematic nature of the Blackwood crimes, the sophisticated methods of disposal, and the sheer number of victims painted a picture of evil that challenged his understanding of human nature. Morrison had dealt with claim jumpers, horse thieves, and occasional murders driven by passion or greed, but nothing had prepared him for the methodical horror of the Blackwood operation. The legal implications of the situation troubled Morrison deeply. While the evidence of murder and cannibalism was overwhelming, the remote location and the family's integration into the community created complications that would have been absent in more settled areas. The Blackwood children posed a particular challenge: what justice was appropriate for young people who had been raised from birth to view murder and cannibalism as normal activities. The village's preparation for confronting the Blackwood family revealed the moral transformation that the discovery of their crimes had wrought in the community. Men who had lived as peaceful neighbors for years armed themselves with hunting rifles and farming tools, their faces showing the grim determination of people who understood that they faced an enemy unlike any they had previously encountered. Thomas Hartwell took charge of organizing the villagers into an effective force, his military experience providing the leadership that the situation demanded. He assigned positions around the Blackwood property, established communication signals, and prepared contingencies for different scenarios. The blacksmith understood that they were not simply arresting criminals, but confronting a family that had shown themselves capable of extreme violence in defense of their way of life. Agnes Crowe struggled with conflicting emotions as the confrontation approached. Her medical oath compelled her to preserve life, yet she knew that the Blackwood family represented a threat that could only be stopped through violence. The children's innocent involvement in their parents' crimes particularly troubled her, as she recognized that Benjamin, Sarah, and Michael were both victims and perpetrators of unthinkable acts. The Blackwood family's awareness of the approaching crisis became apparent through subtle changes in their behavior. Edmund spent long hours sharpening tools and checking weapons, while Martha worked frantically to destroy evidence and prepare for what she clearly understood would be a final confrontation. The children sensed the tension but seemed confused by their parents' obvious preparation for violence. Pastor Webb faced a crisis of faith as he prepared to participate in what might become vigilante justice. His theological training emphasized forgiveness and redemption, yet the magnitude of the Blackwood crimes seemed to place them beyond the reach of Christian mercy. The discovery that the family had practiced their cannibalism while sitting in his church pews, participating in communion, and presenting themselves as devout Christians had shattered his understanding of evil's ability to hide behind religious facades. The community's internal debate about the appropriate response to the Blackwood crimes revealed the tension between frontier justice and civilized law. While Constable Morrison represented legal authority, many villagers felt that the formal judicial system was inadequate to address crimes of such magnitude. The remote location and the family's obvious willingness to use violence suggested that a traditional arrest and trial might not be possible. Charles Whitmore's presence added another dimension to the approaching confrontation. The wealthy merchant's grief over his son's murder had transformed into a cold desire for justice that bordered on vengeance. His resources and connections ensured that the Blackwood crimes would not be forgotten or ignored, but they also raised questions about whether justice or revenge would prevail in the final accounting. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of the Blackwood family, but the moral character of the Greyhollow community itself. The barricaded door was constructed from thick oak planks, reinforced with iron bars, a barrier that Edmund had prepared for exactly this moment. Heavy furniture had been piled against the entrance, creating a fortress within the farmhouse that spoke of long-term planning for a final siege. The door bore scars from axes and rifle butts as the villagers attempted to break through, each mark a testament to the Blackwood family's determination to resist capture and the community's resolve to see justice done. The siege began at dawn on May 15th, when Constable Morrison led the assembled villagers to surround the Blackwood property. The family had clearly anticipated this moment, as smoke rose not from their chimney, but from a bonfire in the yard where they were systematically destroying evidence. Books, papers, personal belongings of victims, and other incriminating materials fed the flames in a desperate attempt to eliminate proof of their crimes. Edmund appeared at an upstairs window with his hunting rifle, the weapon that had served him in countless murders, now aimed at the men who sought to bring him to justice. His voice carried across the yard with the confidence of a man who had faced desperate situations before and survived through violence and cunning. "You have no authority here," Edmund shouted to Constable Morrison. "This is my property, and my family has done nothing wrong. We've been good neighbors and Christian folk. Whatever lies you've been told, whatever evidence you think you've found, it proves nothing against us." The standoff revealed the family's complete commitment to their way of life and their willingness to fight to preserve it. Martha appeared at another window, her face showing not remorse or fear, but defiant anger at the community that had turned against them. Her children remained hidden inside the house, though their voices could be heard as the family discussed their options in urgent whispers. Thomas Hartwell positioned the villagers strategically around the property, using his military experience to prevent the family's escape while minimizing the risk to the siege force. The blacksmith understood that they faced opponents who had killed dozens of people and would not hesitate to add more victims to their tally if given the opportunity. The negotiations that followed revealed the complete breakdown of any pretense of normalcy between the Blackwood family and their former neighbors. Pastor Webb attempted to speak with Edmund about surrender, appealing to whatever remained of his humanity, but the responses showed a man who had long ago abandoned any connection to moral behavior. "You call us monsters," Edmund replied to the pastor's pleas, "but you've all eaten at our table. You've praised Martha's cooking and asked for seconds. You've benefited from our generosity and our hospitality. What makes you better than us? We simply have the courage to do what survival requires." The family's twisted justifications for their crimes emerged during the tense exchanges through the windows. Martha spoke of their cannibalism as a form of natural selection, claiming that the strong had always preyed upon the weak, and that their family had simply embraced this fundamental truth. Their children had been raised to understand that ordinary moral constraints were weaknesses that prevented inferior people from achieving true prosperity. Benjamin's voice could be heard arguing with his parents inside the house, the teenager's growing moral awareness creating conflict within the family at this crucial moment. His journal had revealed his questioning of their practices, and now his objections to their violent resistance suggested that not all of the Blackwood children remained completely committed to their parents' path. The siege revealed the community's internal struggles with the concept of justice. While some villagers called for the family to be burned out of their house, others advocated for a patient approach that might preserve the lives of the children. Constable Morrison found himself mediating between different visions of appropriate punishment, while trying to maintain legal authority in a situation that had moved far beyond normal law enforcement. Charles Whitmore's presence added urgency to the situation, as the merchant made it clear that he would not accept any outcome that did not result in the complete punishment of his son's murderers. His grief had transformed into a cold determination for vengeance that influenced the crowd's mood and reduced their patience for prolonged negotiations. The tactical situation deteriorated as the day progressed, with Edmund taking occasional shots at anyone who moved too close to the house. His marksmanship skills, honed by years of hunting both animals and humans, kept the villagers at a respectful distance while preventing them from rushing the barricaded entrances. The family had clearly prepared for exactly this scenario, with food and ammunition stockpiled for an extended siege. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on all participants, as they realized that the confrontation would likely end in violence regardless of their preferences. The noose was fashioned from rough hemp rope that Thomas Hartwell had brought from his forge, its coarse fibers twisted into the configuration that frontier justice demanded when formal courts were too distant and crimes too heinous for civilized proceeding. The rope bore the smell of honest work, iron and coal dust from the blacksmith shop, but its purpose on this grey May afternoon would transform it into an instrument of final judgment for crimes that defied human understanding. The final assault on the Blackwood farmhouse came when Edmund made the tactical error of leaving his position to retrieve ammunition from the barn. Thomas Hartwell and 3 other village men rushed the weakened barricade while Edmund was exposed in the yard, their combined strength overwhelming the furniture and iron bars that had protected the family's last refuge. Edmund's violent resistance exceeded even the expectations of men who had prepared for desperate combat. The hunting knife that had served him in countless murders flashed in the afternoon light as he fought with the ferocity of a man defending not just his life, but his entire way of existence. His blade found flesh twice before Thomas's hammer connected with his skull, ending the struggle with the sickening sound of bone yielding to iron. Martha's capture proved more disturbing than her husband's violent resistance. When the villagers burst through the barricaded door, they found her in the kitchen calmly preparing what appeared to be a final meal for her children, her hands steady as she sliced meat that subsequent examination would reveal to be unmistakably human. Her composure in the face of inevitable capture spoke of a woman who had accepted her fate but remained unrepentant for the choices that had brought her to this moment. The children's reactions to their parents' capture revealed the depth of their psychological conditioning. Benjamin, despite his journal's evidence of growing moral awareness, positioned himself protectively in front of his younger siblings, his face showing confusion rather than fear. Sarah asked in her innocent voice why the neighbors looked so angry, demonstrating her complete failure to understand the wrongness of her family's activities. Little Michael clung to his mother's skirts, his 3-year-old mind unable to process the chaos but sensing the fundamental change in his world. The discovery of fresh human remains in the cellar provided the final undeniable proof of the Blackwood family's crime. Constable Morrison's investigation of the stone-lined chamber revealed body parts in various stages of preparation, preserved with salt and herbs in methods that showed sophisticated knowledge of food storage techniques. The victim appeared to be a young woman, possibly a traveler, who had sought shelter the past few days, her death representing the family's final act of murder before their capture. Constable Morrison found himself facing a situation that tested the limits of legal authority on the frontier. While territorial law provided procedures for arrest and trial, the remote location of Greyhollow and the overwhelming evidence of the family's crimes created circumstances that formal justice seemed inadequate to address. The villagers' mood had moved beyond the desire for legal proceedings to a demand for immediate punishment that reflected their horror at discovering the monsters who had lived among them. The debate over the children's fate revealed the moral complexity of the situation. While Benjamin's journal proved his participation in murders, his age and upbringing raised questions about his culpability. Sarah and Michael's obvious innocence of any conscious wrongdoing conflicted with the evidence of their participation in cannibalistic meals and their complete normalization of behaviors that violated every principle of civilized society. Charles Whitmore's identification of his son's possessions among the evidence eliminated any remaining doubt about the family's guilt while intensifying his demand for complete justice. The merchant's grief had transformed into a cold determination that would accept no outcome short of the death penalty for the adults who had murdered and consumed his child. Pastor Webb's attempt to provide last rites to the condemned family revealed the theological challenges posed by their crimes. Edmund and Martha showed no repentance, maintaining that their actions had been justified by the harsh realities of survival and the weakness of those who couldn't accept necessary truths. Their lack of remorse made spiritual counseling impossible and reinforced the community's belief that they faced irredeemable evil. The execution that followed reflected frontier justice in its most primitive form. The hemp rope that Thomas had prepared served its grim purpose, as Edmund and Martha Blackwood paid the ultimate price for crimes that had violated every principle of human decency. Their children watched in stunned silence, too young to fully understand the proceedings, but old enough to witness the final destruction of the only world they had ever known. The justice administered that afternoon in Greyhollow carried the weight of community judgment rather than legal procedure, reflecting the harsh realities of frontier life, where formal courts were distant and crimes sometimes demanded immediate resolution. The memorial stone stood in Greyhollow's small cemetery, its granite surface bearing the simple inscription, "In memory of the travelers who sought shelter and found eternal rest. May their souls know the peace denied them in life." Pastor Webb had commissioned the marker from a stonecutter in the county seat, using funds donated by Charles Whitmore as a testament to victims whose names would never all be known, but whose deaths would not be forgotten by the community that had failed to protect them. The Blackwood children disappeared into the care of distant relatives within a week of their parents' execution. Constable Morrison had located Martha's sister in Tennessee, a woman who reluctantly agreed to take responsibility for the 3 young survivors of the horror that had consumed their family. Benjamin, Sarah, and Michael left Greyhollow on a grey morning in early June, their departure watched by villagers who struggled with conflicting emotions of pity and revulsion. Benjamin's final conversation with Pastor Webb revealed the depth of psychological damage that years of conditioning had inflicted. The 16-year-old expressed confusion about concepts of right and wrong that seemed natural to other people, his moral development stunted by a childhood spent normalizing behaviors that violated fundamental human taboos. His questions about whether he would ever be able to live normally among civilized people reflected an awareness that his upbringing had marked him in ways that might never heal. The Blackwood property stood abandoned through the summer months, its buildings slowly surrendering to neglect and the persistent mountain weather. No family would claim land that had been tainted by such horror, and the village made no effort to maintain structures that served as reminders of evil that had hidden among them for 5 years. By autumn, vines had begun to reclaim the garden where human bones had fertilized Martha's herbs, nature slowly erasing the evidence of unnatural crimes. Agnes Crow never fully recovered from the knowledge that she had unknowingly participated in the family's crimes by using herbs grown in soil, fertilized with human remains. The midwife's guilt over treatments she had provided with Martha's plants haunted her remaining years, and she developed an obsessive need to know the source of every remedy she prepared. Her medical practice continued, but friends noticed that she had lost the confident demeanor that had made her such an effective healer. Thomas Hartwell dismantled his forge and left Greyhollow before winter returned, unable to remain in a place where he was constantly reminded of the evil that had masqueraded as neighborly virtue. The blacksmith's final act before departure was to ensure that the hemp rope used in the executions was completely destroyed, burned to ash in his forge fire, as if eliminating the physical evidence could somehow cleanse the community of its moral stain. Pastor Webb struggled with theological questions that had no satisfactory answers. How could people who had sat in church pews, sung hymns, and participated in communion have committed such fundamental violations of God's command? His sermons in the months following the executions focused on themes of hidden sin and the importance of vigilance against evil that disguised itself as righteousness. But his congregation noticed that his faith had been shaken by encounters with darkness that challenged his understanding of human nature. The village itself never fully recovered from the revelation that monsters had lived undetected among them for years. Families that had accepted the Blackwoods' hospitality, eaten meals prepared by Martha, and allowed their children to play with Benjamin and Sarah carried guilt that poisoned their memories and relationships. The tight-knit community that had weathered countless hardships together found itself fractured by knowledge that some of their neighbors had been capable of unthinkable evil. Charles Whitmore returned to Richmond carrying his son's recovered possessions and a satisfaction that justice had been served. But friends noted that his successful business career never fully resumed its previous trajectory. The merchant's encounter with pure evil in the mountains of Virginia had left him changed, more suspicious of human nature and less trusting of appearances that had once seemed reliable indicators of character. The legend of the Blackwood family spread throughout the mountain communities, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and the importance of recognizing evil even when it wore familiar faces. Parents used the story to teach children about the necessity of questioning adults whose behavior seemed unusual, and communities developed informal networks for tracking travelers and ensuring that disappearances would be investigated rather than dismissed. Years later, when new families settled in Greyhollow, they found a community forever marked by its encounter with systematic evil, where neighbors watched each other more carefully and hospitality was tempered by hard-learned wisdom about the capacity for human darkness.